Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 301. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Sergio Mendes with his band at the time, Brazil 77, made actually in 1972. It is typically issued as the album Primal Roots. My copy is the one and only Brazilian pressing, and that is issued under the name Raízes, or Roots. It's a so-called sandwich cover. It goes all the way through. It opens on both sides, and there you can see Sergio and his band, his early 70s band at the time. So AllMusic gives this record a 2-star rating, which is crazy because this is the best record, in my opinion, by arguably Brazil's biggest ever music star. It's made after his pop bossa heyday of the late 1960s, it's made in 1972, and it's principally a record of traditional Brazilian music with some Mendes touches. This record, implicitly, if not explicitly, is Sergio Mendes' response to those who would write him off as the king of elevator music. Now, he is the king of elevator music, but he's more than that. This record is super legit, and if you think you know his music, it will blow your mind. Sergio Mendes is born in Niterói in 1941, and that's just across the bay from Rio. He comes up in the Rio music scene essentially as a jazz pianist, but as the bossa scene starts to germinate in the latter part of the 1950s, he's very quickly into that whole scene as well, and he starts to adapt what was his straight-ahead style jazz playing to the bossa nova sound, and he is really part of that first wave of bossa nova players. Mendes forms various groups around this time in Rio, the best known of which is probably the Bossa Rio Sextet. And in that group, he works for the first time with Tchau Neto, the bassist, who's really a foundational figure in the development of bossa nova rhythms. When the record that Stan Getz and Charlie Bird make, Jazz Samba, breaks the whole bossa nova scene wide open, Neto decides to move up to New York. In 1964, Mendes decides to follow Neto and others to New York and to capitalize on the whole bossa craze. He forms a trio that would play jazz and bossa numbers. He enlists Neto, and he also enlists on drums Chico Butera, an old friend from Rio days. But with bossa nova sweeping not just jazz clubs in Manhattan, but moose lodges and PTA picnics all across the United States, Mendes can see an opportunity which eclipses the world of jazz. To his group, he has Rosinha de Valença on guitar and vocals and Wanda de Sá on vocals, and he calls that group Brazil 65, and they begin to tour the US in the winter of 64-65. In Los Angeles, he's encouraged by Herb Alpert of A&M Records to swap out his 2 Brazilian female vocalists who are unilingual in Portuguese and to sub in 2 bilingual American singers. And coincidentally, one of those ends up being Lani Hall, Herb Alpert's wife and also a co-founder of A&M. That group is then signed by A&M in 1966 as Brazil 66 as specialists in pop-oriented bossa, and they just explode. Their debut record that year, Herb Alpert Presents Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66, goes to number 7 on Billboard, driven by the worldwide smash hit Mais Que Nada. And the hit LPs keep coming. In 1968, Look Around goes to number 5, driven by their version of a Burt Bacharach song, The Look of Love, which they end up performing on the Oscars. Mendes then changes the whole group up after that record, except, of course, perhaps understandably for Lani Hall, and their next record, Fool in the Hill, goes to number 3. And in all of these records, the formula is basically the same. You've heard these songs even if you don't think you've heard these songs. They are light reworkings of Beatles songs and other popular songs of the day, Brazilian rhythms, and beautiful female vocals. What you think of this era of his music is, of course, a matter of taste. I love to dip into it here and there. It's great at parties, but it is undeniably formulaic, and it is undeniably destined for elevators worldwide. As the 60s drew to a close, Mendes kept sticking to that formula, but the hits started to fall away, and the whole venture and concept of Brazil 66 kind of comes to an end by the time that A&M puts out their greatest hits in 1970. Mendes himself is retained by the label, and he still has a lot of cred and a lot of fame. In 1971, he plays the Nixon White House when Prince Juan Carlos of Spain comes to visit. But as the 70s begin to roll on, Mendes' time in the American spotlight has kind of drawn to a close. So his focus returns to Brazil and to perfecting and updating that fusion of American jazz and pop and Brazilian rhythms, which is basically his life's work. In 1971, he forms a new group as a vehicle for this sound. Somewhat eccentrically, he doesn't call it Brazil 71, maybe because Brazil 66 was almost immediately out of date sounding as soon as the year rolled over, so he calls it Brazil 77. Importantly, he brings Chao Neto back in on bass, as well as Oscar Neves, who was really one of the great guitarists of that mid-60s second wave of bossa nova players. The Beatles covers are out, MPB is in, J.J. Cale covers are in, and a slightly jazzier and occasionally funky feel is there as well. He still has a pretty big following worldwide, and a lot of the stuff is really of pretty high quality. There is a fantastic record they put out in 1971, I think, called País Tropical. But fascinatingly, in 1972, he briefly abandons loungecore, jazz, pop, fusion, Brazilian American, what have you, for one record, takes a hard left turn, and makes an album which stands apart from the rest of his work, is arguably the least commercial thing that he ever did, and many would say is the best thing he ever did. This record, Raízes, or Tropical Roots, was made in the early part of 1972 at Sergio Mendes' palatial home, where he had a home studio in Encino, California. Mendes himself is on piano and vocals. He also arranges all the tracks, and he is the producer of the record. The bass is played by Chao Neto. Oscar Neves plays some phenomenally beautiful acoustic guitar. The archetypally beautiful female vocals are provided by Gracinia Leporace and by Jerry Stevens, who, when she was much younger, went by the name Dodie Stevens. In 1959, as a 13-year-old, she sold 1 million copies of a pop single called Pink Shoelaces. And there's a 4-man percussion section, including the legendary Airto Moreira, Laudir Suarez, Claudio Sloan, and Rubens Bassini. And there's a ton of authentic Brazilian musicianship on here, including traditional instruments like the agogo, which is kind of a cowbell, and the cuica. The cuica is also known as the friction drum. It's the drum that's got the stick basically right through the center of the drum, which you move in and out and makes that distinctive sound, which I'll try and mimic here. Most of the record is comprised of Mendes' arrangements of traditional and popular musical styles of Brazil, sometimes using traditional songs, sometimes more contemporary compositions. And many of the songs in the record relate in some way to a religion called candomblé, which is a regional religion in Brazil very popular amongst musicians, particularly those from Bahia. The compositions and the musicianship and the overall vibe and groove are fantastic. The result, however, is a long, long way from Burt Bacharach and The Look of Love, and A&M was pretty reluctant to release this record. Sergio thankfully insisted. It's released in July 1972. It enters the Billboard charts for 1 week at number 170 and then sinks without trace, so maybe A&M had a point about the commercial viability. But since then, it has received praise from all manner of sources, all largely to the effect that this is Mendes' forgotten gem. Side 1 starts with the Dora Valcami song, Promessa de Pescador, which has Brazilian rhythms and vocals which are clearly not just Brazilian, but have a huge debt to West Africa as well. A very beautiful song, and that is also true of the next one, After Sunrise, which is a composition by Neves and Neto, and everything I said about the vocals and the rhythms for the prior song applies here, but you also have Neves' lovely acoustic guitar to the fore. Canto do Uburantan has percussion to the fore, it's so rhythmic, and these excellent call and answer vocals, it just kicks. Next song is Yamanja, or Yamanja, I'm not quite sure what the Portuguese pronunciation is. This is a song by the Brazilian guitarist Baden Powell. We have more of Neves' beautiful guitar playing, and finally on side 1, a fairly brief track, but another rhythm fest, Pomba Gira, and you feel like you're in a Brazilian village in the countryside. Side 2 is basically given over almost entirely to one track, Yoga de Roda, or The Circle Game, which is a song by Edu Lobo. This is a sprawling, multi-part, polyrhythmic journey with some incredible flute playing by a guy called Tommy Scott. Is it the best track on the record? Maybe. It's certainly the most adventurous piece of music on the record, and it is genuinely Brazilian/jazz fusion. It has zero to do, as far as I can tell, with bossa nova. Anyway, that song takes 20 minutes. It's a very brief reprise at the end of side 2 of Promise of a Fisherman, and that's that. This record, some critics would have it, is the most sort of serious and important record that Sergio Mendes released in his whole career. I'd take issue with the more extreme versions of that, but it is a record, unlike pretty much any of the other records he made, which has precisely 0% cheese. It's also beautifully recorded. It will open your eyes, and if you own no other Sergio Mendes record, this is one you should investigate. Personally, I love it, and I'd give it 5 out of 5.